One thing that I want to look at when doing a deal, which most people don't want to look at or don't want to face, is what happens if a deal goes sideways? What happens if we run into a bump? If everything went smooth all the time, this would be too easy. Everybody would be doing it. So there are real life situations that you have to run into, and there's a couple traps that we tend to see on flip projects where people get into or run into a bit of a jam. And there's ways to avoid them. In fact, there's two major ones that I would say you can eliminate these two, and you eliminate two huge problems in front of you. I'll talk about the one, which is simply flat out buying too high. And if you watched our video from last week, you're aware of the fact that if you comped right and you backed your numbers out correctly, you're not in jeopardy of buying too high. But if you didn't do that and you bought too high, I would say you're really starting behind the 8 ball on that. You're already in a bad position. You never want to be in a bad position in a real estate deal. So buying too high would be the first one to make sure. If you think you're low enough, you probably should go lower. That's the honest answer. And if you think you're low enough, then probably go lower than that when you're trying to buy. Believe it or not, there are plenty of deals out there at numbers that you wouldn't believe, but you would believe them if you're making offers every day and dealing with people in the business. And Jay also has the next step in the trap that you can run into and you want to be aware of if you can avoid it.
Yeah, and a lot of people buy too high because they're emotionally attached to the property for one reason. They're like, oh, well, I want to buy this $5,000 less, but I can make it up on the back end. You'll never make it up on the back end. So the second most important thing that you need to make sure you have under control is your construction. And a construction typically makes or breaks the deal on every deal, right? And it's inexcusable to go over construction budget. It just cannot happen. Just can't happen. So for instance, if you have a $30,000 construction budget and you spend $5,000 over, that's in essence you paying $5,000 too much for the house. It doesn't make sense. You cannot go over your construction budget. You need to make sure you're doing everything on the front end to have that under control. For instance, don't try to tell somebody, or I shouldn't say tell somebody, don't try to put a property under contract and settle like 2 days later. Give yourself time. Yes, you should settle fast in order to get a property under contract. That being said, get your trades in there, get your people in there, get you in there, and make sure you fully understand what your construction numbers are. Do your due diligence. Like I said, going over the construction budget is like spying the property for 2 months. Too much. It cannot happen. There's no room. You really, 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 really need to hone in on that. And I'll tell you that the majority, maybe not the majority, but a lot of borrowers we work with get themselves in a bad situation because their construction numbers were not fully evaluated and handled accordingly on the front end, and they run into problems and they need to put more money into the deal until it just doesn't work.
Or you take a sweetheart of a deal that is a sweetheart of a deal, and then what happens is you get into construction and it's like Jay said, you might as well, if you paid $130 and you go over your construction by 20, you might as well just paid $150.
Yeah.
So I recommend, along with what Jay said, once you have your firmly established construction numbers that you're aware of, Put a margin of error in there. Add an additional 10% to your own construction number, or 20%, or whatever that comfort level is, because assuming everything runs perfectly, which it never does, this is what your number will be. Well, account for the margin of error. Assume there's a 10 or 20% buff in there, and then surprise yourself in the right direction. If everything does run smooth, you just made an extra 10 or 20% on your construction your construction. If it does not go correctly, you were prepared for it anyway. So it's really important to look at those two traps, being buying at the right number and then making sure your construction is where it needs to be.
And remember, if you're going over construction, that means you're also going over your time frame that you thought you were going to flip this property in, meaning additional holding costs, finance costs, etc.